A dark night had fallen over the city, and inside the police station, where dim lights flickered on the gray walls, mocking voices could be heard. The surveillance cameras creaked, watching every movement. Into this atmosphere of cold and indifference, a man was broad and thin, with a drooping posture, moving around in a wheelchair. His gaze was calm, but there was weariness in it, and a hidden strength that few could see. "Hey, look, a new record." They brought in a disabled person right away. "What, should I give you a ride to the cage, hero?" Someone's rough voice sounded. The two policemen looked at each other, grinning. It seemed they forgot where they were and who they were, playing the role of hooligans rather than defenders of order. The wheels of the wheelchair squeaked on the floor as they roughly pushed the man toward the cage. At one point, one of them, tall and strong, stood in front of him, arms folded. "Why are you so quiet? Come on, maybe you could sing a song when we close the door." The holding cell was small and dingy, with cold metal bars that cut into the space like sharp needles. One of the policemen, laughing, opened the heavy door. "Well, welcome, Chief. This place is just for your kind," he said, and slammed the lock shut with a loud click. The man said nothing, but a shadow flickered in his eyes, as if foreshadowing something important. However, his silence only provoked the police. They sat down opposite the cage, opening their coffee mugs, as if preparing for a show. "Well, why are you silent? Maybe you'll imitate a dog, or a bird in a cage. What do we care? No one will complain about you anyway." The second policeman chuckled. The hours dragged on slowly, but the man in the cage continued to sit quietly, as if waiting for something. His gaze remained directed straight at them, and from that cold, piercing gaze even the most self-assured smiles began to be erased from their faces. "What is he staring at? Does he have problems?" one of them muttered, but without his former bravado. They didn't know who this man was, and they didn't suspect that their actions were already being watched by those who were not at all inclined to forgive such jokes. The bars that they had so easily locked were about to become a cage for themselves. The policemen's laughter echoed across the empty station, hitting the walls. They sat at a table across from the cage, clearly enjoying their game. The man in the cage was silent, his hands resting comfortably on the armrests of his wheelchair, but his eyes continued to bore into both officers. This seemed to irritate them. "Hey, you!" one of them shouted, a skinny man with red eyes from fatigue. "Do you even realize where you are? Do you think your black skin will give you any privileges? Here, boy, you're just another piece of trash, and keep quiet until you're asked." The second one, the larger one, grinned and slammed his mug on the table. "He doesn't even talk, Henry. Maybe he's afraid, or he doesn't have the brains to answer. Well, what else can you expect?" He paused, took a sip of coffee, and continued. "Listen, you. Do you even know anything about discipline? About being grateful? We basically saved you here. Imagine what they would do to you on the street." "He's never seen discipline in his life," Henry snorted contemptuously. "They're used to giving him handouts, a pension, benefits. He's earned nothing, deserved nothing, but he demands everything. He's so special." The man was silent, his calmness seemed defiant, and this only angered the policeman even more. "Hey, maybe we should have some fun here," the big one suggested, glancing sideways at his partner. "We'll bring a ball and throw it into the cage. Let's see how he gets it. Let's have a dog circus." Henry slapped his palm on the table. "Yeah, come on. At least it's some fun. Hey, you invalid, you ready for the show?" The man tilted his hat slightly, looking at them calmly and intently. His lips moved slightly. "It's amazing," he said quietly, and his voice, though not loud, sounded as if it burned the air. "What did you say there? Repeat it." Henry tensed, rising from his chair. "It's amazing," a man repeated a little louder. "How much hatred there is in you, how much cowardice." The policeman stepped closer to the cage, his face contorted with anger. "Are you calling me a coward? You, a fucking legless freak sitting in a cage. I can do whatever I want to you. No one will know. No one will lift a finger for you. Maybe you'll try." The man's voice was still even, but there was a challenge in it. The big policeman also stood up. "Henry, come on. He's trying to get us to go crazy. It's always like that with these guys. First they keep quiet, then they play the victim, and then someone's on the street burning in protest." "You're right, Joe." Henry took a step back, but his gaze was still angry. "But they won't make him a victim. He's nobody here." At that moment, Something clicked faintly in the surveillance system behind the police officers. The man in the cage smiled again, but in such a way that it was almost unnoticeable. "Do you think that power protects you?" he asked calmly. "Do you think this is a cage for me? What are you even talking about?" Henry laughed, but his laugh sounded forced. "Look around." Carefully, the man leaned forward slightly, his eyes flashing. Who did the door really slam on? The policemen looked at each other. Their amusement was beginning to give way to a strange uneasiness, but they still did not understand why. The man seemed to have been waiting for this moment. A barely perceptible shadow of victory flickered across his face until the first sounds of approaching footsteps were heard outside the station door. Time dragged on painfully slowly in the station, as if every second was deliberately delayed in order to torment him longer. The man in the cage continued to sit, not moving, but inside he felt increasingly cold from the words that rained down on him like sharp fragments. The policemen, feeling that their victim was not getting in, began to get angry and became increasingly aggressive. "You think you're special?" Henry stood in front of the cage, arms folded, his gaze full of contempt. "You think your chair would give you some kind of immunity? You're no better than anyone else. Just a pathetic black tramp who is lucky enough to be born in a country where everything is free." Free. The man spoke for the first time in a long time, his voice quiet but full of controlled strength. "You call this luck? Shut your mouth." Henry stepped closer, his face turning purple. "You're here because you're nobody. People like you only know how to whine, demand, complain. Do you think being disabled makes you better? No, you're just another nuisance that only causes problems for everyone." Joe chuckled, standing against the wall and watching his colleague. "Henry, why are you so worked up?" "He's just trying to show that he has some pride." "Funny, isn't it? A black man, and a cripple at that, has pride?" "Really?" Henry nodded, grinning crookedly. "Now show me your pride." Stand up if you can." "Oh, sorry, you can't." The words came out like a lash. Joe laughed louder, and Henry continued, his voice growing more and more venomous. "Do you know why they put people like you in a cage? Because you're an animal. You're a parasite who brings nothing but torment to people like us. We work so you can get your allowance. We keep the city in order so you can ride around in your wheelchair. Where's the thank you? Oh yeah, you're so ungrateful, aren't you?" The man didn't answer. His hands tightened on the armrest of the wheelchair, but his face remained calm, even though each new splinter of their hatred cut deeper. "What? Have you swallowed your pride?" Henry leaned down lower so that his face was closer to the bars. "You are not a man. You are a mistake of nature, and this chair only emphasizes that you will never be someone important." Joe came closer, holding a plastic bottle of water. "Hey, do you want a drink, or should I bring you this too?" He unscrewed the cap, pretended to hand over the bottle, but then suddenly splashed the water right at the man. "Oh, sorry, did you get some water on the motor there?" Both policemen burst into loud laughter, but the man, despite his wet clothes and humiliation, raised his head and looked straight at them. There was no anger or despair in his eyes, only a cold calm that began to catch the laughter in their throats. "What? You think you're better than us?" Henry tried to get himself going again, his voice sounding nervous. "You can't even walk. You're a loser. You're the one who can't walk," the man said suddenly. His voice was so quiet that Henry had to lean forward to hear it. "You're bound by your fears, your prejudices, your hatreds. It's not me who's locked in this cage. It's you." The words sounded like thunder in the silence. Joel and Henry frowned, looking at each other. "Are you some kind of philosopher or something?" Henry burst into nervous laughter, but it no longer sounded as confident as before. "No." The man looked at them in a way that sent a chill down both policemen's spines. "I'm the one who's going to make you look in the mirror." And at that moment, as if to confirm his words, the door to the station abruptly opened. People in formal suits stood on the threshold, and in their eyes, one could read the same cold confidence as in the eyes of the man in the cage. The door swung open with a deafening crash, shattering the barely perceptible balance of the room. The room that had been filled with ridicule and malice suddenly went silent, a silence as thick as a thundercloud before a storm. 3 people stood on the threshold, 2 men in formal dark suits and a woman with a folder under her arm, her face motionless as stone. "Who are you?" Henry, barely recovering from his surprise, stepped forward. His voice was sharp, as if he were trying to regain control. "Federal Inspectorate for Human Rights," one of the men answered briefly. not bothering to look at Henry. His eyes settled on the cage where the wet and quiet man Saturday. Open the cage. Immediately. Excuse me. Joe raised his eyebrows mockingly. Who's in charge here? We're actually in a police station. Your federal papers mean nothing here. The woman with the folder stepped forward, casting a look full of icy contempt. Open the cage, or we will. Believe me, then you will have much bigger problems. Henry, trying to hide his growing concern, shrugged and turned to face the man in the cage. Oh, so it was he who called you, the invalid. Well, of course, it's all clear with you. His voice was filled with sarcasm again. You protect people like him, right? The unemployed, the black, the poor, anything to make them feel important, right? You've gone too far, said one of the inspectors, his voice like thunder. Too far. Henry laughed, but there was a nervousness in his laugh. Do you even know who's sitting here? This guy is a nobody. He can't even walk. You think he's a hero. He's a parasite. All he knows is how to complain. Henry, stop, Joe muttered quietly, feeling that the situation was getting out of control. No, let them know. Henry turned to the inspectors, his face twisted in anger. This damned invalid thinks he's better than us. He sits here in his black leather, in his chair, and thinks he has the right to dictate to us how to do our jobs. The inspectors watched him silently, their faces unreadable, but their gazes made Henry feel uneasy. Open the cage, one of the men said again. Who the hell is he? Henry pointed at the man in the cage. Just tell me who he is. Why are you all running around this, a human being? The voice from the cage interrupted. The man finally raised his head, his eyes clear, his face calm. I am a human being, and you have proven that you cannot even understand that. Don't you dare talk to us like that. Henry stepped toward the cage, gripping the metal bars. His face was flushed with rage. Ew, a black cripple. Think you can? That's enough. The inspector's voice was sharp and unyielding, like the crack of a whip. He turned to the woman. Write this down. Every last word. She nodded, her pen moving quickly across the paper. Do you know what you did? The inspector continued, his voice thick with contempt. You locked out a federal human rights inspector. You exposed yourself to every possible law governing abuse of power, racism, disability discrimination. You destroyed your career the moment you slammed that lock. Henry turned pale. What did you say? The man in the cage, the one they had thought was the victim, finally turned around to face them. My name is Marcus Gray, he said, his voice calm but with an air of unbreakable strength. I'm a federal inspector, investigating complaints of racism and discrimination in your precinct, and you've proven everything I expected, and more. This is a joke, right? Henry stepped back as if he'd been hit. This is some kind of prank. This is not a joke, one of the inspectors said calmly. Your actions have been recorded. Video recordings from the station have already been handed over to the appropriate authorities. You have destroyed yourself, added the second inspector, looking straight at Henry. Joe, who had been standing silently all this time, finally muttered, We didn't know. You didn't know. Marcus's voice broke from its icy flatness. You didn't know that humiliating a person for the color of his skin, for his disability, is not only immoral, but also illegal. You didn't know that your joke would make you criminals. The police frowned. The atmosphere in the room was so thick, it felt like it was pressing on their chests. Henry opened his mouth to say something, but found no words. Marcus looked at them one last time, then slowly leaned back. Lock them in this cage. That's where they belong. The words echoed off the walls, and the inspectors headed for the door, leaving Henry and Joe standing in a cold silence that no longer held power or certainty, only fear. Henry stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily. His face was twisted with a mixture of rage and fear, but he couldn't stop. Everything was going wrong, but inside him, anger was seething, poisoning the last of his common sense. He turned back to the cage, where Marcus Saturday just as calmly, and it was this calm that infuriated Henry the most. You think you won? You think these feds are going to take you away from here and make you a hero? You're not a hero. You're dirt. You're a parasite. Henry stepped closer, his fingers tightening around the cold metal bars. Sitting in your chair, pretending to be a martyr. You think your black skin makes you a saint? No, it makes you a weakling. You've accomplished nothing. All you've gotten is handouts from people who work 1,000 times harder than you ever worked. Joe, standing against the wall, looked up but made no move. his face bewildered. It was as if he knew Henry was going too far, but he couldn't find it in himself to stop him. Henry continued, almost shouting now. Do you know why I hate people like you? Because you're not people. You're just a pathetic shadow. You're worthless. Do you think you're smarter than us? Do you think you can ruin my life with your games? But I'll tell you something. No one cares about you. Okay, no one. Marcus finally raised his head, and his gaze met Henry's again. There was no anger in his face, only a cold, expectant determination. Nobody cares, he repeated quietly, like an echo returning from a distant gorge. But why then are you trying so hard to humiliate me? Henry frowned. His eyes narrowed. What did you say? If I'm worthless? If I'm nothing? Marcus's voice was a whisper, full of tension, like a taut string ready to snap. Why are you so angry? Why are you screaming? Henry hesitated, but then his rage returned. I'm trying to show you your place, bastard, because you're kind, always get into trouble. You people think they can dictate terms, but no, I am the law here, and there's nothing you can do about it. The law. Marcus leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. The law that allows you to hurl racial slurs, to belittle people for their disabilities. The law that makes you king of this dirty precinct. No, Henry, that's not the law. That's your hate. That's your fear. Fear. Henry stepped closer to the cage, his face distorted. You dare talk to me about fear? I'm not afraid of people like you. You're afraid, Marcus interrupted, his voice low but hitting like a hammer. You're afraid because you don't see me as what you're used to seeing. Not as a victim, not as broken. You see someone who looks you straight in the eye and doesn't hang his head. It drives you crazy, doesn't it? Henry shook, his fingers gripping the bars so tightly they turned white. You don't know anything about me, he yelped, his voice breaking. You don't know anything, you bastard. I know enough. Marcus leaned back, his gaze as relentless as an icy storm. I see how you destroy yourself. Your hatred eats away at you from the inside. It makes you weak. It has made you a prisoner in this cage, even if you don't realize it. Henry frowned, his breathing heavy, his face flushed. You think you're above me. You think you're smarter. His voice shook as it tried to maintain the appearance of control. But Marcus had already torn that illusion apart. But I can destroy you. One word from me, and you'll stay here forever. Destroy it. Marcus smiled slightly, but there was nothing joyful in dismay. Try it. I'm ready. And you. The words hung in the air like a clap of thunder. Henry seemed to realize for the first time that he was standing on the edge of a cliff. His face went white, and he stepped away from the cage as if it had suddenly burned him. Joe tried to speak, but the silence in the room was so thick that the words caught in his throat. Henry opened his mouth, closed it, and then turned abruptly and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Marcus remained in the cage, still sitting motionless in the wheelchair. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if exhaling the tension that had built up over the long hours. But inside, he knew this was only the first battle, and there were more storms to come. The room fell into a tense silence again, broken only by the faint hum of the security camera in the corner. Joe remained standing against the wall, his gaze darting nervously between Marcus and the door, through which Henry had disappeared. Marcus had not moved in the cage, but the silence around him was thick, almost tangible. It pressed on Joe like an invisible force. He wanted to say something, but he could not bring himself to break the oppressive atmosphere. Do you know what you've done? Joe finally muttered, but his voice was weak, almost pathetic. He was trying to remain calm, but the words seemed empty, meaningless even to him. You just ruined your life. Henry will come back, and then what? Marcus interrupted quietly, without looking up. His voice was calm, but in this silence, it sounded as if it were cutting through the air. Do you think I'm afraid of him? Afraid of you, or the system you've built to keep people like me in fear? Joe swallowed nervously. It seemed to him that this man in the cage could see right through him. His entire facade, the mask of indifference and cruelty he had worn for years, was crumbling under Marcus's gaze. You're just trying to act strong, Joe finally blurted out, though there was no conviction in his voice. But you're nobody. You think you can beat us all. We see people like you every day. And you know what? You always lose. Always. Marcus slowly raised his head and looked at Joe. There was no fear or anger in his eyes, only a cold determination and a strange, frightening confidence that Joe couldn't understand. Every day, you say. Marcus asked, his voice so quiet that Joe barely caught the words. Every day, you see people like me, but what do you really see? You don't see people. You see a threat. You see your fear. You look at us and think we're here to take your place from you. But the truth is, you took everything from us. Oi, we didn't take anything. Joe flared, though his voice sounded as if he were trying to convince himself. You ruined it all. Your culture. Your inability to work. Our culture. Marcus interrupted, his voice harder now. Culture, what do you know about our culture? You only see what's convenient for you to see. You see our mistakes and make them our essence. But you don't see how the system you built drove us to those mistakes. You don't see how your fear and hatred made us targets. Joe paused, unsure of what to say. Deep down, he knew that Marcus's words were touching something deep inside, something he was trying not to think about. You know, Marcus continued, bowing his head slightly, you're not as bad as your partner. You don't scream about me being a nothing, but your silence is a crime, too. You stand there, silent, and let it happen. You're comfortable with others doing your dirty work, but in the end, you become the same. Joe flushed, his face turning red with anger. You don't understand how this works, he shouted, taking a step forward. I'm just doing my job. It's the system, not me. Do you want me to drop everything and go against my own people? It's not as easy as you think. Marcus looked at him with a long, piercing gaze that made Joe feel small again. You're right, Marcus finally said, his voice almost soft. It's not easy, but you know what's even harder? Getting out of bed every day, knowing that you're hated simply for who you were born as, knowing that you'll never be seen as a person. It's harder than you can imagine. Joe stepped back as if the words had hit him in the face. At that moment, the door opened again and Henry returned. His face was grim, and he was holding something heavy in his hands. Joe noticed a metal rod that Henry was clutching as if he was about to break something or someone. Well, hero, Henry said, his voice low and dangerous. You think you're smart. You think you can humiliate us here. I'll show you who's boss. Henry, stop. Joe took a step forward, his voice shaking. You've gone too far already. Shut up. Henry turned sharply to his partner, his face contorted with rage. You want to protect him. That black bastard. Then you're just like him. Joe frowned, and at that moment Marcus spoke again. That is your fear, he said quietly, but there was a power in his voice that seemed to fill the room with tension. You are afraid that one day someone will look at you the way you look at us. You are afraid that you will lose your power, and that fear makes you beast. Henry took a step toward the cage, holding the metal bar in his hand, but something changed. A siren cut through the air, and suddenly the door swung open again. The same federal inspectors stood there, but now a group of uniformed men were visible behind them. Homeland Security officers. Henry Brooks, the inspector's voice said, cold and unyielding, you are under arrest for abuse of power, abuse of office, and hate crimes. Henry frowned, his face white as paper. He slowly lowered the rod and looked at Marcus, whose eyes were calm but filled with a strange, frightening triumph. In that moment, Henry realized the cage he had built had slammed shut not around his victim, but around himself. Henry stood like a statue, clutching the rod, while the federal inspectors watched him, as if waiting for his next move. His breathing was quickening, his face twisted in anger. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he wasn't going to back down. He glanced at Marcus, who remained in the cage, calm, with the same expression of fearless confidence. It was driving Henry crazy. This is all your fault, Henry hissed, dropping the rod and taking a step toward the cage. You think you've won? You think your Fed buddies are going to save you? No, you're going to be the same piece of shit you were before. Black, helpless, worthless. Henry turned to the inspectors, his face filled with anger. Don't you see who he is? He exclaimed, pointing at Marcus. He's not a victim. He's a parasite. People like him live off people like us. I go to work every day, risking my life, and he sits in his chair and complains about life. He doesn't deserve an ounce of respect. He's just another one of those people who feel sorry for themselves. Marcus stared at Henry, motionless. His face remained unreadable, but something in his gaze made the inspectors wary. Henry continued, feeling that he could no longer contain himself. You Feds think you're making the world a better place, protecting people like him. You betrayed him. You made him believe he was important, that he mattered. But you know the truth. He's nothing. He's just another black man on welfare. and no one will ever want to see him on the same level as us." The inspectors exchanged quick glances, but did not interrupt. Joe, pressed against the wall, looked nervously at his colleague, his face filled with fear, but he did not intervene. He simply stood and watched as Henry sank deeper into his own hatred. "You sit there," Henry continued, turning back to Marcus, his voice growing stronger, "and you think you're better than me? You think you can look down on me? You're in a cage. Kid, you're helpless. This is your place. You think your disability makes you special. No, it makes you even more useless." Henry's voice was filled with venomous contempt, and it began to pace the cage like a predator surrounding its prey. "You'll never get up. You'll never be a man. You can sit here with that look on your face all you want, but all you're doing is proving that you're just an animal. An animal in a cage, and a cage is the only place you can be." Marcus finally raised his head, his gaze meeting Henry's, and though he said nothing, that gaze made Henry freeze for a moment. There was something unbearable in that gaze, something that made Henry feel naked. "What are you looking at?" Henry snapped, trying to regain his confidence. "Do you have something to say? Come on, say it. Or are you so pathetic that you can't even speak?" Marcus smiled slightly, barely noticeable, almost mockingly, and this finally drove Henry crazy. "You're worthless," he screamed, his voice echoing around the room. "You're nobody. You're just a black cripple who'll never amount to anything. Never." Henry's words hung in the air like a blow. Even the inspectors watching the scene frowned for a moment, but Marcus didn't react. He lowered his head again, as if Henry's words were nothing more than background noise. The silence only increased Henry's rage. "You think this is the end?" Henry leaned closer to the cage, his face twisted in hatred. "No, but this is just the beginning. When this is over, you will stay here, and I will make you feel what it is to be worthless. You will drown in your worthlessness." But before Henry could say anything else, the inspector's voice interrupted him. "Henry Brooks, that's enough. You've crossed all the lines." Henry sat up straight, as if he had been doused with ice water, but even under the pressure of the inspectors, he did not back down. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This man is a threat. He is trying to destroy everything we have built, everything that makes us strong." "Strong," Marcus said, suddenly quiet, interrupting Henry's monologue for the first time. His voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it. "You call this strength? Humiliation, hatred, fear. This is not strength, Henry. This is your weakness, and it will destroy you." Henry frowned, his face twisted in rage, but he couldn't say anything. That moment of silence seemed like an eternity before the inspectors approached him. "Henry, you're under arrest," one of them repeated. "Right now. Any resistance will only make your situation worse." Henry didn't move. He stood there, breathing heavily, his gaze darting between Marcus, the inspectors, and the cage. Finally, he took a step back, but his face remained twisted with hatred. "You'll pay for this," he whispered, looking at Marcus. "I won't forget." Marcus didn't answer. His gaze returned to the floor, but there was more power in the gesture than in Henry's rage. The cage Marcus sat in had long since ceased to be his prison. It belonged to the one who had filled him with hatred. The inspectors surrounding Henry slowly and coolly led him out of the room. His ardor was fading, but not gone entirely. Even in handcuffs, he kept looking over his shoulder, hurling insults and threats at Marcus. "All of you," he hissed, his voice still filled with hatred, but already sounding weaker. "You think you've won? You think you're stronger than us? You're nothing but parasites, worthless, black bastards who take over everything we've built." His voice echoed around the room, but no one answered. Marcus sat in the cage, motionless, his gaze fixed on nothing. The inspectors did not respond, and Joe watched silently, cowering in the corner of the room. His face was a mixture of fear and shame, but it said nothing. Henry suddenly stopped at the door and took one last look at Marcus. His eyes were blazing with malice. "You think your pretty words mean anything?" he shouted. "You're nothing but a black cripple, and you'll stay that way all your life. You can pretend to be above us, but no one will respect you. No one. You're not worthy of respect. None of you are." The inspectors led him out the door without a word, and the room fell into a deathly silence. Time seemed to stand still. No one moved. Only the dull sound of Henry's footsteps retreating down the hallway reminded him of his presence. But even when he was gone, his words remained in the air like a heavy cloud. Joe finally decided to speak. his voice weak and hesitant. Listen, he began, but the words got stuck in his throat. Marcus turned his head slowly and looked at him. That look, as before, pierced Joe through. He felt small, as if he had been exposed. All his attempts to justify himself, all those years of turning a blind eye to what was happening, all of it was torn apart by that one look. Did you want to say something? Marcus asked quietly. His voice was even, but there was a hidden power in it that made Joe take a step back. Joe swallowed, fiddling with his hands nervously. Look, I'm not like him. I was doing my job. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Marcus grinned, but it was a cold, almost contemptuous grin. You didn't want to? He asked, his voice a little louder, a little firmer. What did you do to stop it? You stood there, Joe. You listened to him insult me, listened to him sling mud at me, and what did you do? You just stayed silent. I couldn't do anything, Joe blurted, his voice shaking. Hemi, you know what he's like. He's always been like that. I couldn't stand up to him. It would have been stupid. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes boring into Joe. Are you afraid of him? Afraid that he will break you? His voice was almost a whisper, but each syllable was like a blow. Then you are no better than him. You are both the same. You both close your eyes when it suits you. You both choose strength when you think no one can stop you. Joe exhaled sharply and stepped forward. No, I'm not like him, he cried, his voice shaking with anger and fear. I don't hate you. I've never hated people like you, like me. Marcus raised his eyebrows slowly, his face calm but his eyes blazing with a dangerous glint. Who are we, Joe? Like me, people with dark skin, people who can't walk, people who don't fit your idea of normal. Joe paused. He realized what he had said, but the words were already spoken. They hung in the air like heavy weights he couldn't shake off. You don't understand, Joe, Marcus continued, his voice quiet but all the more powerful for it. Your actions and your words are the same thing. You may say you don't hate, but your inaction says otherwise. Your silence allowed him to do everything he did. Joe hesitated again, but at that moment the door opened again. A female inspector stood in the doorway, a folder under her arm. Her face was hard, cold, as if carved from stone. She glanced at Joe, then at Marcus. Everything is ready, she said. We've reviewed all the records, and now I want to hear his words. She pointed at Marcus. Joe turned pale, realizing the game was over. The room was once again filled with an icy silence, broken only by the sound of the pages of the folder being turned in the inspector's hands. The woman took a step forward, her heels pounding the floor like a drumbeat before something inevitable. Her gaze was fixed on Marcus, but it seemed as if she were looking through him, gathering the picture in her head. Is there something you wish to say, Marcus Gray? She asked in a flat, dispassionate voice, without taking her eyes off the documents. Marcus slowly raised his head, his gaze meeting hers. He looked calm, but there was a hidden energy in that calm, like a tiger about to pounce. Tell me, he repeated, his voice soft, but every intonation of it penetrated the consciousness of those present. Yes, I have much to say, the inspector nodded, and motioned to her colleague standing by the door. He picked up the clipboard, which was already full of notes. All eyes were on Marcus. Even Joe, who had been nervously averting his eyes until now, was now looking at him, as if expecting a blow he would not be able to parry. Marcus leaned forward, his hands resting on the armrest of his wheelchair, but his posture exuded strength and confidence. What happened here today? He began, his voice level but steely. Isn't just insults. It's not just hate. It's a pattern. The words hung in the air like a bolt of lightning. The inspector raised an eyebrow slightly, and Joe clenched his teeth, as if expecting Marcus to point at him. Instead, Marcus continued, not raising his voice, but filling each word with meaning. Every time someone like him uses his power to humiliate, to break, to show his superiority, it is not his own fault. It is the fault of the system that allowed him to feel so invulnerable. It is the system that taught him that people like me are not people, but objects for his hatred. The female inspector bowed her head slightly, listening intently, but her face remained impassive. Marcus continued without stopping. But the system doesn't work alone. It needs silent accomplices, people who look the other way, like Joe did, people who are afraid to go against the grain, people who think their silence makes them innocent. Hey, I didn't, Joe tried to interject, but the woman raised her hand, stopping him. Your silence, Joe. Marcus looked at him, his voice hardening, made you as guilty as Henry. You knew what was happening, and you did nothing. You stood by and watched your partner insult me, humiliate me, and that's what makes the system strong. Joe lowered his head, his face flushed. He muttered something, but no one paid attention. But this system, Marcus continued, now addressing everyone present, will no longer go unpunished. I am not here today simply as someone who has been humiliated. I am here as a representative of all those who have suffered at the hands of the likes of Henry, and I will not stop until the likes of him are held accountable. The inspector took a step forward. We've reviewed all the footage, Marcus, she said, her voice still level, but now with a note of respect. You're right. Everything that happened here proves that the problem is much deeper than the actions of one officer's. It's the root of the entire system. She turned to her colleague, who nodded and pulled a phone out of his pocket. A few seconds later, other officers began to enter the room. They were in uniform, but they did not belong to this precinct. Their faces were serious and determined. What's going on? Joe finally couldn't take it anymore. What's going on? The female inspector repeated, giving him an icy look. What's going on is that everyone involved in today's events is going to be investigated. And it's not just Henry. Joe turned pale. But I didn't do anything. That's the problem, Joe, Marcus said again, and there was no anger or hatred in his voice, just a cold statement of fact. You did nothing, and that makes you just as guilty. The woman waved her hand, and two officers approached Joe. His face turned white. He began to say something to justify himself, but no one listened. When he was led out of the room, silence filled the space again. Marcus looked at the female inspector who slowly approached the cage. She released the lock, and the door creaked open. Your work is not finished, Mr. Gray, she said, her voice softer than before. We know you came here for a reason, and now, thanks to you, we can begin to change what should have been changed years ago. Marcus looked at her, then at the open door of the cage. He slowly pulled out, leaving behind the cage that had been his symbolic prison for so long. The cage was empty now, but it still belonged to those who had built it out of hatred and fear. This day was the beginning of something greater, and though there were many more battles ahead, Marcus knew that today he had taken the first step toward destroying the system that was trying to destroy him. The room fell silent again. The officers led Joe away, and his feeble attempts at justification vanished behind the closing door. The female inspector nodded to her colleague, and then turned her gaze to Marcus. There was something in her eyes that suddenly made the air in the room grow even colder. All attention was now focused on the one person who remained at the center of the action, Marcus Gray. Marcus had been silent the entire time, but his silence was deafening. He vibrated in the room, building tension until it reached a crescendo. The female inspector motioned for him to continue, but at that moment the door swung open again. Henry stood there, his face pale and his hands shaking. His gaze darted between Marcus, the female inspector, and the other officers. I mean, Henry began, but his voice broke. He swallowed, trying to muster the last of his confidence. But it was like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground was about to give way beneath his feet. Marcus turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Henry's. There was no anger or triumph in that gaze, only a cold, piercing clarity. He didn't say a word, but it was enough for Henry to begin to feel his confidence crumbling. Henry took a step forward, but stopped as if he did an invisible wall. His voice was shaking. You did this on purpose, didn't you? You thought you could make me look like a monster, but you're not there either. I know you. You know. Marcus suddenly interrupted, his voice quiet but sounding like it was cutting off all of Henry's escape routes. You don't know anything, not about me, or what I'm doing here, but today you're going to find out. The words, spoken with icy certainty, made Henry freeze. The female inspector said something quietly to her colleague, and he led the other officers out of the room. Now only three remained, Marcus, the inspector, and Henry, who looked as if he could hardly breathe. You thought I was a normal person, Marcus continued, not taking his eyes off Henry. You thought you could humiliate me, lock me in a cage, destroy my dignity, but you know what's most interesting? I didn't come here by accident. Henry swallowed, his hands shaking, and he started to back away, but the female inspector stood behind him, blocking the exit. You can't be, he muttered, his face growing paler. It's impossible. Marcus bowed his head slightly, his voice becoming even quieter, but this made it sound even more threatening. Federal Human Rights Inspector, he said, each word falling like a hammer blow. That's my official title. And you, Henry, have just become an example of why I'm here? Henry frowned, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. No, you're lying, he whispered, but there was no confidence in his voice. This is some kind of joke. This can't be true. You were what they called you, the female inspector reminded her, her voice sounding as if she were recording the proceedings. You saw our ideas. Or are you saying that this too is a fabrication? Henry tried to find the words, but they wouldn't come. He suddenly realized that he was no longer in control. His world, built on his power, was collapsing like a house of cards. I didn't know. He squeezed out, grasping at his last chance to justify himself. I didn't know who it was. It was a mistake. Just a mistake. Marcus finally moved forward, his wheelchair gliding silently across the floor. When he stopped right in front of Henry, his gaze was like an icy blade. A mistake? He asked, and there was just the slightest hint of sarcasm in his voice. Were your words a mistake? Your actions a mistake? Or your hatred? Henry shook his head, his voice a helpless babble. I didn't mean to. I just... You wanted to, Marcus interrupted, his voice now as cold as a winter wind. You wanted to show your power. You wanted to break me, but you couldn't. And now you're afraid? Henry began to tremble, his knees buckling. You're not afraid of me, Marcus continued. You're afraid of the consequences. You're afraid that your career is over. You're afraid that your actions will finally matter. The female inspector stepped forward, opening a folder. Henry Brooks, she said, her voice like a sentence. We have recorded all of your actions. They will form the basis of a criminal case. You are accused of abuse of power, racism, defamation of honor and dignity, and gross violation of professional ethics. Henry fell to his knees, his face pale, his hands shaking. Please, he muttered, his voice a whisper. I can't explain everything. I didn't mean to. I just... Marcus leaned closer, his face still but his eyes blazing with icy determination. I didn't lock you in that cage, Henry, he said quietly. You did it yourself, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. The room was silent, except for Henry's heavy breathing. He was broken, and Marcus, he knew that the victory was not his own. It was the victory of truth over a system of hate. Henry Saturday alone in the small room that now served as his cell. It was a simple isolation cell, with bare concrete walls and a single light bulb that flickered. As if mocking him, he felt the tightness pressing down on him, filling the air with a sense of hopelessness. It was quiet all around, but the silence was worse than any noise. It seemed to remind him that he was alone. Completely alone. Henry tried to calm his breathing, but every time he closed his eyes, scenes from the interrogation room came back to him. Marcus' words, calm and precise as hammer blows, echoed in his head. It wasn't me who locked you in this cage. You did it yourself. The phrase stuck in his mind like a splinter. Henry knew he was no longer the same man who had walked into the station a few hours earlier. Back then, he had felt invincible, strong, protected by the system. And now that protection had vanished like a mirage, leaving him alone with his fears. He looked around the cell and a feeling of claustrophobia washed over him. It felt like the walls were closing in, cutting off his oxygen supply. Henry clutched his head, gritting his teeth to keep from screaming. It's a mistake, he muttered, his voice shaking. I was just doing my job. It's a mistake. But the more he tried to justify himself, the louder Marcus' voice sounded in his head. You wanted to show your power. You wanted to break me, but you couldn't. Henry stood up and began to pace the cell like a caged animal. His legs were shaking, his hands were clenched into fists. He tried to think of a way to get out of this situation, to justify himself, to prove that he was not guilty, but every excuse sounded false even to himself. Footsteps were heard outside the door. Henry frowned, his heart pounding. The door opened and a female inspector walked in. She was holding a folder and had a cold, professional mask on her face. She stopped in front of him and looked at him intently. Henry Brooks, she began, opening the folder. Your behavior has become a symbol of everything that needs to change in this system, and I think you're beginning to realize it. I didn't mean to, Henry began, but his voice broke. It doesn't matter anymore, she interrupted, her voice firm but not angry. We've collected enough evidence. All the recordings, your words, your actions, all of it will be used in court. Henry collapsed onto the bench, clutching his head. But I can't go back there, he whispered. You don't understand. They'll tear me apart. The inspector looked up, and a faint shadow of regret appeared on her face. This isn't isolation from the truth, Henry. This is isolation from the system you've supported. You've been part of it for too long. Now you'll have to face the consequences. I can fix this, he said, raising his head, his voice shaking with desperation. Give me a chance. I can fix this. Fix it, she asked, her gaze softening. How are you going to fix the years of hatred and fear you've spread? How are you going to restore dignity to those you've humiliated? Henry fell silent. He didn't know what to answer. Perhaps correction begins with confession, the inspector continued. But this is not about your correction. This is about justice being done. She took a step back, about to leave, but Henry suddenly jumped to his feet. Wait, he shouted. What will happen to me? The inspector stopped but did not turn around. You will get what you deserve, she said, keeping her voice low. It's fair. The door closed behind her, and Henry was alone again. He sank down onto the bench, his hands shaking, but it wasn't just anger or fear, no, it was realization. He suddenly realized that he was no longer protected by the system he had long considered his shield. He was now the target. Outside the detention center, life went on in the city. Marcus's story was already spreading like wildfire. News of a federal inspector who had exposed racism in a police department was going viral. People were talking about justice, about how long the system had turned a blind eye to such cases, and how it would no longer be tolerated. Marcus Saturday in his wheelchair outside the courthouse after leaving the station. Journalists and activists gathered around him, but he was silent, looking into the distance. He knew this was just the beginning. There was still much to do, but at that moment, he felt that for the first time in a long time, justice had won a small victory. And in the isolation cell, Henry Brooks was alone with his fears, and worst of all, he was alone with himself. Henry Saturday in the corner of the cell, clutching his head in his hands. The walls around him felt oppressive, as if they were getting closer with every breath he took. Marcus's voice still rang in his head. A cold sentence. I didn't lock you in this cage. You did it yourself. Those words hit him harder than any physical blow. For the first time in his life, he realized his vulnerability. He realized that his power, his humiliation, his privilege were just an illusion created by fear and hatred. Outside the cell, the world continued to change. The news was filled with headlines. Federal inspector exposes racism in police. The story of Marcus Gray, a man against the system. People who had been afraid to speak out about their pain for years finally found the strength. Marcus became a symbol of the struggle, not because he wanted fame, but because his silent dignity broke down the fragile walls of hatred, behind which those who thought themselves invulnerable had hidden for so long. Meanwhile, Henry began to sink into his own fear. He couldn't understand what was coming next. Would it be years of imprisonment, or would his name become synonymous with shame? Every second alone was torture. The silence was unbearable, but the voice in his head was even worse. He realized that justice didn't come from outside, it came from within, destroying everything he once thought was right. A few days later, Marcus was back at the station, but this time, he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by lawyers, activists, and federal officials. They were there not just to document Henry's case, but to launch a broad review of the system that had allowed incidents like this to happen for years. One of the officers, who had previously tried to keep a low profile, approached Marcus, his face tense. Mr. Gray, he began, but the words caught in his throat. Wanted to say, thank you. Marcus looked at him, his gaze soft but penetrating. Thank you, he asked again. Yes, the officers replied, looking down. I saw how Henry behaved, but I was afraid to do anything. Now I realized that keeping silent made me an accomplice. Marcus looked at him for a long time before answering. Acknowledgement is the first step, he said quietly, but it is not enough. The next step is action. The officers nodded, realizing that these words were addressed not only to him, but to the entire system. At this time, voices were heard outside the window of the station. A crowd had gathered to show support for Marcus and others who had been discriminated against. People held signs with the inscriptions, Justice for all. The fight has just begun. We see, we hear, we fight. Henry could hear the sounds from his cell. They were like a bell ringing, signaling change. He knew his world would never be the same again, but instead of the rage he had felt before, there was an emptiness washing over him. He suddenly realized that he could no longer justify himself. His anger, his hatred, had all been an attempt to hide his fear of losing control, but now that fear consumed him. Marcus knew his work was not yet done. Henry's story was just one episode. The system still existed, and there were new battles to be fought. But now he saw people rising up around him. Those who had been afraid to speak up were now finding the strength. When Henry's trial began, he became an example to many. Witnesses testified in the courtroom, and the records from the station became the main evidence. Henry tried to justify himself, blaming pressure, saying that everyone does it. But these words no longer impressed anyone. Society no longer accepted such justifications. Marcus was in the courtroom the day the verdict was handed down. The judge declared Henry guilty on all counts, and his face went white. But when Henry looked at Marcus, he saw not triumph in his eyes, but a quiet, confident determination. After the trial, Marcus walked outside to applause, but he raised his hand for silence. "This is not the end," he said, his voice firm but calm. "This is only the beginning. We have not defeated a man. We have taken the first step toward destroying a system that has destroyed lives for too long. This is not my victory. This is the victory of all who have chosen to speak out." The crowd erupted in applause. People began chanting his name, but Marcus only smiled as he passed them in his carriage. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he wasn't alone now. He had a whole world with him, ready to fight for justice. Friends, this story makes you think about many things. What do you think about what happened? Have you encountered injustice or racism in your life? We will be glad to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments. Each of your stories is important and helps us understand how to make our world a better place. We appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for taking the time to share your feelings and support each other. If you share our mission to speak about what matters, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us tell more stories that really matter. Have a nice day, full of kindness and justice. Remember, each of us can be part of the change.